For decades, Linux carried a certain mystique. It was the operating system of hackers, and curious power users who were willing to wrestle with configuration files, cryptic error messages, and a command line that seemed hostile to the uninitiated. Installing Linux once meant partitioning disks by hand, editing bootloader configurations, hunting down drivers, and praying your graphics card would cooperate. That difficulty became part of Linux's identity. It was hard, but in that difficulty, there was power, control, and a sense of mastery. Today, though, something has clearly changed. Linux has never been easier to install, easier to use, or easier to recommend. Modern distributions boot into polished desktops, detect hardware automatically, update themselves silently, and offer app stores filled with one-click installs. This raises a provocative question. Is Linux becoming too easy? And if it is that actually a problem? To understand why this question matters, we have to look at where Linux came from. Linux was born in the early 1990s as a hobbyist project, a kernel created by Linus Torvalds and shaped by a global community of developers. Early Linux systems were built by people who enjoyed tinkering. They were comfortable reading documentation, compiling kernels, and debugging issues themselves. There was no expectation that Linux should cater to beginners. In fact, the difficulty was often framed as a feature. If you could use Linux, you had proven something about your technical competence. This culture influenced everything from documentation to community attitudes. New users were often told to read the manual or dismissed outright if they asked basic questions. It was not a welcoming environment, but it was a passionate one. Over time, Linux began to spread beyond hobbyists. Servers, supercomputers, and embedded systems adopted Linux because it was stable, flexible, and free in both cost and licensing. Enterprises invested heavily in Linux, building professional distributions, offering paid support, and contributing back to the kernel. As Linux matured in the server world, it also slowly improved on the desktop. The process was gradual and often frustrating, but undeniable progress was made. Hardware support improved, installers became friendlier, and desktop environments evolved from clunky experiments into refined user interfaces. Fast forward to today, and the Linux landscape looks radically different. A user can download a popular distribution, boot it from a USB drive, click through a graphical installer, and be up and running in under 20 minutes. Wi-Fi works out of the box, printers are detected automatically, software updates are handled through simple notifications. For many users, there's little reason to open a terminal at all. This ease of use is not accidental. It is the result of years of work by developers who wanted Linux to be accessible, competitive, and welcoming. But for some longtime users, this shift feels uncomfortable. They worry that something essential is being lost. One concern often raised is that making Linux easier dilutes its educational value. Traditionally, using Linux forced users to learn how operating systems actually work. You learned about file systems because you had to mount them. You learned about processes because you had to manage them. You learned about networking because nothing worked until you configured it. This hands-on exposure created a deep understanding that many professionals credit for their skills today. When everything is abstracted away behind graphical tools, critics argue, users become passive consumers rather than active learners. Linux, in this view, risks becoming just another black box. There is also a fear that ease of use leads to complacency. When systems just work, users may stop questioning how they work. They may rely on default without understanding their implications. This can be especially dangerous in areas like security. Linux has long been praised for its security model, but that model assumes users understand permissions, users, groups, and privilege escalation. If new users are shielded from these concepts, they may misuse powerful tools without realizing the risks. A system that feels simple can still be complex underneath, and hiding that complexity does not make it disappear. Another argument centers on culture. The Linux community has historically valued curiosity, experimentation, and self. As Linux attracts more mainstream users, the community inevitably changes. Support forums become flooded with beginner questions. Developers may prioritize user-friendly features over advanced documentation may be simplified to appeal to a broader audience. For some veterans, this feels like a loss of identity. Linux was not supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be empowering through understanding. When Linux starts to resemble other consumer operating systems, they worry it loses what made it special. However, these concerns need to be balanced against the benefits of accessibility. One of the most common criticisms of Linux in the past was that it was too hard for normal people. This limited its adoption on the desktop and reinforced the perception that Linux was only for experts. By becoming easier, Linux opens itself to a much wider audience. Students, artists, writers, small business owners, and everyday users can now benefit from free and open source software without needing a technical background. This democratization aligns closely with the philosophical roots of the free software movement, which emphasized freedom and accessibility for all, not just elites. Ease of use also does not necessarily eliminate depth. Modern Linux distributions may hide complexity by default, but that complexity is still there for those who want it. The command line still exists. Configuration files can still be edited. Advanced tools are still available. The difference is that users are no longer forced to confront complexity before they are ready. Instead of being thrown into the deep end, they can wade in gradually. This can actually improve learning outcomes. A user who starts with a friendly desktop environment may later become curious about how things work underneath and choose to explore further. In contrast, a system that is hostile from the start may drive users away before they ever reach that stage. It is also worth questioning the idea that difficulty equals quality. Just because something is hard to use does not mean it is better or more educational. Sometimes difficulty is simply the result of poor design or historical baggage. Many of the painful aspects of early Linux usage were not intentional teaching tools. They were limitations. Improving those limitations does not necessarily weaken Linux. In fact, it can strengthen it by allowing developers and users to focus on meaningful problems rather than unnecessary obstacles. Another perspective to consider is the broader computing landscape. Users today are accustomed to polished experiences. Smartphones, tablets, and modern operating systems set high expectations for usability. If Linux remained deliberately difficult, it would struggle to remain relevant outside niche circles. By becoming easier, Linux positions itself as a viable alternative to proprietary systems, especially in a world increasingly concerned about privacy, control, and vendor lock-in. Accessibility is not just about convenience. It is about choice. An operating system that only experts can use is not a real choice for most people. There is also an economic dimension. As Linux adoption grows, so does the ecosystem around it. Hardware vendors are more likely to support Linux if there is a large user base. Software developers are more likely to release Linux versions of their applications. Educational institutions are more likely to teach Linux if it is approachable for students. All of this creates a positive feedback loop that benefits everyone, including power users. Making Linux easier can actually lead to more resources, better tools, and improved support across the board. That said, the risk of oversimplification is real. If Linux distributions chase ease of use without regard for transparency, they could undermine trust. Users should be able to understand what their system is doing, even if they do not need to manage every detail. Clear documentation, sensible defaults, and accessible explanations are crucial. The goal should not be to hide Linux's nature, but to present it in a way that is welcoming rather than intimidating. Another important point is that Linux is not a single product. It is an ecosystem of distributions, each with its own philosophy. Some prioritize ease of use and polish. Others prioritize minimalism, control, or education. This diversity is one of Linux's greatest strengths. Users who want a simple experience can choose a beginner-friendly distribution. Users who want to learn everything from the ground up can choose a more hands-on approach. The existence of easy Linux distributions does not eliminate harder ones. Instead, it expands the range of options available. In this sense, the question is not whether Linux is becoming too easy, but whether Linux is becoming more flexible. The answer appears to be yes. Linux can now be many things to many people. It can be a reliable server, OS, a developer workstation, a student's first computer, or a hobbyist's playground. Ease of use is simply one dimension of that flexibility. As long as Linux continues to respect user freedom and choice, ease does not have to come at the expense of depth. There is also a generational aspect to consider. Many of today's experienced Linux users learned in an era when information was scarce and tools were primitive. Struggling through those challenges shaped their identity and skills. New users are learning in a different context, with abundant documentation, tutorials, and community support. Their path to expertise may look different, but that does not mean it is inferior. Learning does not require suffering. In fact, reducing unnecessary friction can allow learners to focus on concepts rather than mechanics. We should also question whether the fear of Linux becoming too easy is partly rooted in game. Difficulty can create a sense of exclusivity. When something becomes accessible, it can feel less special to those who struggle to master it. This is a natural human reaction, but not necessarily a healthy one for a community. If Linux is about freedom, collaboration, and sharing knowledge, then lowering barriers aligns with those values rather than betraying them. At the same time, communities need to actively preserve pathways for deeper learning. Beginner-friendly tools should coexist with advanced documentation and opportunities for exploration. Encouraging curiosity, explaining design decisions, and maintaining transparency are key. Linux does not need to force users to learn, but it should invite them to. A well-designed system can be both easy to start with and rewarding to master. Security and reliability also deserve attention. Simplifying user interfaces must not oversimplify security models. Clear warnings, sensible permission systems, and educational prompts can help users understand the consequences of their actions. Ease of use should not mean removing safeguards or obscuring critical information. The challenge is to design systems that guide users without patronizing them. Looking forward, the trend toward easier Linux is likely to continue. Technologies like immutable operating systems, containerized applications, and automated updates aim to reduce breakage and maintenance overhead. These developments can make Linux more robust and user-friendly, but they also change how users interact with their systems. Traditional practices like manually installing packages or editing system files may become less common for everyday users. This shift may feel uncomfortable for some, but it reflects broader changes in computing, where reliability and security are increasingly prioritized. The key question, then, is not whether Linux should be easy or hard, but whether Linux should remain true to its core principles. Those principles include openness, user control, and community-driven development. Ease of use can support these principles if implemented thoughtfully. Making Linux accessible does not require locking users into opaque systems or stripping away choice. On the contrary, it can empower more people to take control of their computing. In the end, the idea that Linux is becoming too easy assumes that difficulty is an inherent virtue. History suggests otherwise. Many of the world's most powerful tools are also the most user-friendly. They succeed not because they are hard, but because they scale with the user's needs. Linux is increasingly doing the same. It offers a gentle entry point for newcomers and immense depth for those who seek it. So, is Linux becoming too easy? In some ways, yes. And that is largely a good thing. It means fewer barriers, broader adoption, and a healthier ecosystem. The real challenge is ensuring that ease does not turn into opacity, and that simplicity does not erase the opportunities for learning and mastery that have always defined Linux. If the community can strike that balance, Linux will not lose its soul by becoming easier. Instead, it may finally fulfill its promise as an operating system for everyone without sacrificing the power that made it special in the first place.